Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of July 19th, 2020. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the United States Transhumanist Party. We are looking forward to an interesting conversation today about science fiction, artificial intelligence, potential future conflicts, and the implications for our own society and the future of the transhumanist movement. So with us today, we have a panel of US Transhumanist Party officers. We have Secretary Pavel Ilin, Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker. We have Art Ramon Garcia, our Director of Visual Art. We have John Karatz, who is our Director of Energy Issues, and of course, Charlie Kam, our 2020 US presidential nominee and Director of Marketing. And our special guest today is Rykon Volta, who is a member of the US Transhumanist Party and the Washington State Transhumanist Party, and also a science fiction author. He wrote the novel recently published called Erendite, the Art-elect Protocol. And this novel creates a very interesting world in the years 2571 and 2572 and raises some issues that are of significant relevance to the transhumanist movement and the future prospects for advanced technology. So welcome to Rykon. And the first question that I would have for you is to simply ask you to summarize in a way that doesn't provide any spoilers the general setting of Erendite. What is this book about? What is the world in which it takes place? And what are some of the key issues involved?
So Erendite is the first installment of the Art-elect Protocol trilogy, a series of novels I'm currently writing. Erendite takes place in 500 years from the year 2071. In the prologue, the Earth is destroyed in 2071 and by a war based off of Hugo de Garis's The Art-elect War. Basically, the Terrans and Cosmos get into a conflict over the creation of artificial intelligence. The Cosmos think it's the next step in evolution. The Terrans believe that it is evil and should be destroyed. And at the end of the war, in my story, the Terrans destroy the Earth because the Art-elect is helping the Cosmos to win the war. And they send out a propaganda message to Mars and Ganymede, the two off-world colonies that are still alive, that the Art-elect was responsible for the destruction of Earth, and that convinces those governments to illegalize all transhumanist technology. 500 years later, in the main plot, the solar system has been colonized from the seeds of those two colonies, and a young space pirate named Terran is on a mission to steal a computer chip, and he falls in league with a resistance group of people who are modifying themselves with cybernetic enhancements illegally against the Art-elect Protocol, which would have them put to death. The chip implies the existence of an ancient artificial intelligence that has escaped Earth before the Art-elect War was over. And the Brotherhood, the resistance group called the Eclipse Brotherhood, must use the data on that ship to locate the Art-elect so that they might use its vast godlike intelligence to free the solar system from the oppression of the Art-elect Protocol. The space pirates end up joining their group for a nobler cause than their former life, and must fight the powers that be, the Jovian Empire, an empire encompassing all of the moons of Jupiter, and the Martian Republic, which are in the background of the story about to get into a better war with themselves. The resistance group is basically transhumanistic. The basic idea of the plot line is to paint the picture of transhumanism and artificial intelligence as a benevolent force, as a sort of a counter movement to traditional Hollywood tropes where an AI is an evil demon that's going to try to destroy us all.
All right,
So,
well, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm good.
Okay, so we have a question in the chat, and I think Jason Geringer just wants to ask as a clarification. So the protocol, the Artilect protocol, doesn't allow cybernetic enhancements. And I would say, yes, that's the premise. Essentially, anyone caught pursuing cybernetic enhancements or genetic modifications or trying to build an artificial intelligence is to be put to death, according to this very draconian Artilect protocol, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so this is a fascinating premise of the story for multiple reasons. First of all, this Terran versus cosmist conflict, which Hugo de Garis posits in his book, The Artilect War, is one where in the mid 21st century, there would be a major war between two factions. And the Terrans believe that humankind should essentially remain in its original unaltered form, and they're opposed to the development of especially sentient artificial intelligence, but they're skeptical of any sort of technology for modifying the human organism more generally beyond a kind of baseline health, what today would be considered baseline health. The cosmists believe in actively pursuing and accelerating these technologies. And of course, the transhumanist movement today would be very much aligned with the cosmist ideas. Indeed, the precursor of transhumanism in late 19th century Russia was the cosmist movement. And this was where de Garis also derived the term. So both in de Garis's work and in yours, the Terrans start the conflict. It's not that the cosmists intend to destroy humanity or rule humanity or somehow interfere with people. It's that the Terrans are fearful, and they, via their backlash, actually provoke the war. So what are some of your thoughts on that and the risks of that happening? Do you consider that to be a realistic concern for our future, that as these advanced technologies continue to be developed, and some people are supportive of them, that there would be this backlash from a certain faction of people, call them Terrans or anything else? But do you think there's a real risk of this kind of major war erupting later in this century?
Realistically, I would be more inclined to agree with Ray Kurzweil, and that man's work is what inspired me to become a transhumanist in the first place when I was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of the Artilect War to me was a good launching pad for a science fiction story. Fiction stories always look good when you add a lot of crazy conflicts into them. In reality, I hope we don't have any war like that, obviously. I don't think that there's a high risk of it. I think that most people are pretty much down with the idea of technological growth. I think that most people today, if you talk about transhumanism, they'll just kind of laugh at you and be like, oh, that's never going to happen. That's crazy. You guys are smoking weed or something. The truth is, they would have said the same thing in the early 1900s about somebody saying we're going to land a man on the moon. I think people will just naturally accept these technologies as they come out.
Mhm.
Like they accepted the smartphone without even realizing they were accepting the smartphone. Like now virtual reality is coming into the mainstream and people aren't even really noticing it. I agree with Ray Kurzweil in that when the technologies roll out, they're kind of just going to stealthily or not really noticeably integrate into society. People are just going to take them for granted, and
So,
they're not really going to put it.
so essentially, this tendency of technologies to become gradually and somewhat seamlessly integrated into everyday life as soon as they become commercially available to large numbers of people would tend to counteract this sharp Terran cosmist divide from emerging, because people will adopt these technologies over time, and as they adopt successive generations or successive kinds of technologies, they're going to approach more closely to Ray Kurzweil's vision of the integration of humans and machines, to the point where it's not going to be us versus them. It will be all us, essentially, including the AI and AGI components. So, David, what are your thoughts on that, as contrasted with the possibility of this major clash in the future?
Yeah, I do want to comment on that, but first I want to say, Rykon, I've read your book and I very much enjoy it, and I look for the next installment.
Thank you.
So it was quite a read, and I would recommend it to any of the people here that are on this call to get the book. It's an easy download from Amazon Electronic if you want to do that, and an easy read on the Kindle, and quite fascinating. To the topic that we're talking about, one of the distinctions that the book brought out for me was how what I consider to be the basal humans, the Terrans in the book, were quite adept at adopting technology that gave them spacecraft, and then later on in the book, they gave them an interstellar transportation system, and they were quite willing to adopt that. But anything that actually touched the human body, anything that was medical, not so much, and that's where the division came from. So I think there's some parallels to that in today's society. Yeah, the enhancements that we see in automobiles, people have easily adopted. Cell phones, as we pointed out, flat screen televisions, those things that are inanimate, I guess, are easily adopted by society. But we're seeing things now in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic where there's great controversy over things that are medical, vaccines and treatments and the science behind that. So I saw quite a parallel between that in the book. I think that the Ray Kurzweil solution, well, it's not a solution, it's a prediction that I too subscribe to, is that what saves us as humanity going into the future is combining with these technologies, not only externally, but internally in our bodies as well, because I look forward to being able to incorporate that myself. But the parallels between what's going on in society now and some of the parallels in the book, I found pretty fascinating.
Yes, indeed. And thank you for those remarks, David. Now, Charlie, given your familiarity with Ray Kurzweil and his thinking, what do you think about Ray Kurzweil's vision as a kind of way to prevent this major conflict from arising in the 21st century?
Well, I agree with Rykon and David in that I believe more about the way Ray Kurzweil describes our future as opposed to Degaris. I did not read Rykon's book, but I'm familiar more with Hugo Degaris. He was actually one of the people in the film that I helped produce, Transcendent Man. In the film, he was almost a protagonist, antagonist rather, in that he had these rather dire outcomes in a sense. His predictions were there would be, that I guess similar to some of the plot line in the book, or I don't know, I think I said I didn't read it, but he predicted that there would be this war between, the Ardalects, and that there would, and the people that weren't enhanced, and that there would be billions of people would die because of the people that wouldn't want to accept it. And I know that when he was being portrayed in the film, I mean, and he was making these statements, these were things that Ray Kurzweil did not agree with, and it was and a lot of other ones in the film, and other people that were advisors to the film did not agree with that. They were much more on the side of the idea that humanity would adapt these new iterations of technologies that would be beneficial to them. And as Rykon was saying, they would just adapt without even necessarily thinking about it. There would be no reason for conflict if it's not upsetting people. If it just makes life easier, which it will. I mean, at first it might seem a little strange for people because they're not used to something, which is normally the case for almost anything. But eventually people adapt, and as we know, younger generations who grew up with a new iPhone every few months or so have a mindset that's even more readily adaptable to new things. So we have to keep in mind the way a younger generation might be looking at a new innovation and say, well, they're going to adapt pretty quickly because they're used to it. They grew up. That was part of the way they looked. I mean, I think older people call it attention deficit disorder. I think newer generations are going to say, no, that's just how we think. We think because that's what's coming anyway, right? I mean, we're going to start to merge with technology. We see things like what Musk is trying to do with an interface with the brain. So you're going to see that we're going to want to not only have access to information readily available to our brain, but we're going to think faster. We'll have means to do that. So I don't think there's ever going to be a conflict the way it was described by Daguerre's. And I think, as your question was about Ray Kurzweil, I'm much more inclined to agree with the way Ray presented the future coming about.
Yes, thank you for those remarks, Charlie. And certainly I hope that's the future that will come to pass. In the chat, one of the commenters, Why Not Now, says, quote, I don't think it will be quite so black and white with two groups opposed to each other. And perhaps that will be because of this integration with technology over time. Now, Art Ramon, do you have any thoughts on this question of whether there will be this gradual integration or more of this Terran cosmist opposition?
I believe in the gradual integration. And suppose today you were to actually cut off your thumb. You're not going to drop to your knees and pray and hope it magically reattaches. You're going to go out to the hospital and have it reattached by medical professionals. 1,000 years ago, that wasn't an option. You just had to tie it off and cauterize it. So as technology advances, people are going to be accepting of it. You will have some religious folks who may not accept it, and they'll be going off into their colonies separate from the rest of us. But yeah, I think a majority of the people are going to accept it, except for those few religious people who don't believe in any type of medical intervention, be it stem cells or surgery or any transhumanist tech.
Mm-hmm. So, and I'm inclined to agree. Most people are open to technology. There are certain factions of the society that are more skeptical or even have strictures against it, like the Amish, but the Amish have never been dominant and they have never tried to force their beliefs onto people outside of their community. Now, with the so-called bioconservatives, there is more of a concern. If you look back at, say, President George W. Bush's Council on Bioethics with people like Leon Kass, as well as others like Daniel Callahan and Sherwin Nuland, who argued against life extension research intentionally because they thought it was somehow counter to the human condition and what gave meaning to life. And I would say those types of opposition, which are more specifically focused on biomedical research, would be more likely than a general anti-technology stance. But even in the world that Rykon portrays, there is, as David mentioned, a great deal of technological advancement. In the 500 years that passed since the destruction of Earth, the rest of the solar system is essentially colonized, and there are these O'Neill cylinders like the one in my background that serve as major human habitats, and Mars has been terraformed, the moons of Jupiter have been extensively developed, and as a result, humankind continues, and humankind has made huge advancements in space technology. But also in this world, the average life expectancy has been reduced to 65 because life in space is still harsh, and they don't accept medical advancements that go beyond the so-called baseline health. So it's still a kind of crueler world than our own in this storyline. It reminds me in many ways of historical dynamics after the collapse of a major civilization. For instance, after the fall of the Roman Empire, a lot of competencies were lost in terms of architecture, engineering, art, scientific knowledge. And there were attempts to reclaim the glory of the old Roman Empire periodically, for instance, during the Byzantine Empire, or various attempts by European monarchs, Charlemagne being the most prominent, but then also the Attonian dynasty, which kind of amplified the concept of the Holy Roman Empire. So how would you, Rykon, describe the likelihood of this kind of dynamic of civilizational collapse and gradual resurgence happening again?
I think that in the near future, I think that the singularity is going to so completely change the ways humanity lives and civilization works that nothing after the singularity is recognizable to a human brain. I don't think we can comprehend what comes after the singularity. I don't think there will even be need for a state or a government after the singularity, personally. I don't think, some people say we're going to be a hive mind integrating into an advanced intellect. Other people like me prefer to maintain our individualities. And I would be more akin to the idea of uploading your brain into a robot of your own design, like your own personal computer, being able to put up a firewall between other minds or connect with them as you and them will consensually. And basically, some people might choose to live on Earth, create their own avatars that are just like their former human bodies. Some people might take off and move to the Andromeda galaxy or create a space colony in their own personal space colony in an asteroid somewhere nearby, or whatever they choose to do. But that's my view on the future of humanity. I don't think we're going to have a state after the singularity, personally. Governments are an artificial construct to keep order in a society that is based on scarcity, in my belief.
Well, what does everyone else think about that vision of the future in terms of a technological singularity happening in the middle of the century, perhaps, after which a lot of these old frameworks might not be relevant, including the concept of a government? Charlie, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree. I think what Rykon said is true. I kind of agree with everything exactly the way he described it. In fact, and that's coming right out of what he's described is basically right out of Ray Kurzweil's books, which I wholeheartedly accept and agree with. In fact, there was a summit in South Africa about like a year or so ago, a singularity summit, I should say, where they actually some of the keynote speakers were proclaiming that they think that the singularity could happen by 2035. And I know that that's been some of the descriptions from other people like Ben Gertz and some other authors that say, if we put enough resources in, there's no reason why it can't happen sooner. So I believe what Rykon said, and I do think there's going to be a situation where once the singularity happens, it'll be hard, if not almost hard. Well, it'd be hard for us to currently predict what would happen after the singularity is going to happen, because there will be basically instantaneous doubling of informational technology or computational technology. So it'll change the world as we know it. The idea of an abundance economy is going to change the dynamics of our economy, so much so that capitalism won't make sense. It's not even about whether it's right or wrong. It just would be obsolete essentially. So there's going to be a lot of changes that will happen when the singularity comes about, or even when it's getting pretty near. Which that's the name. The singularity is near. And by the way, I should mention again, Ray's coming out with his sequel to that book, The Singularity is Nearer, which would have came out this year, but it'll come out next year. And he's going to address some of those issues in an updated way.
Yes, The Singularity is Near would be quite a fascinating read, especially these days. And I'm actually glad for the delay, because I hope Ray Kurzweil could address the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic and societal fallout, and whether he thinks that will disrupt the pace of technological progress in any way. I know he has said in the 20th century, the major world wars and revolutions and social upheavals did not disrupt the pace of technological progress, but there are certain aspects of COVID-19 and the societal reactions to it that are different, in the sense that we've never had a situation of intentional economic shutdowns before. And I do wonder how that would affect the trajectory of growth going forward. Would it be a delay of a few years? Would it be no effect? Would it be an acceleration because people are channeled into the use of more advanced technologies, and there's also more of a focus on medical research, at least in the area of combating COVID-19? Or would it be kind of the first set of dominoes in a chain that ultimately leads to civilizational collapse? So there's a whole spectrum of possibilities as to what this pandemic could do. And I'd be interested in Ray Kurzweil's view of this. I would be interested in everyone else's view of this as well, given the very unusual times that we're living in. Now, Pavel, I'm curious as to your thoughts regarding what has been said thus far.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I believe that I would agree with Charlie about singularity and about the post-singularity world, that it's the most of the concept we playing with now would not make sense in this world. And for human level intelligence, it's impossible to describe what the world going to look like over there, if it's already will happen. Because in a world when you have AGI and like super intelligence and nanotechnology, those problems will be raised, which is we have no coherence to even describe, even come up with a problem. Whereas the humans would have a problem to predict how we're gonna work with a problem we know, but how we're going to describe the unknown of unknown. So it would be magical world which if we're gonna stay in this on a human level intelligence, would be not impossible for us to grasp.
Yes, thank you, Pavel, for those remarks. And any other thoughts from the panelists on these questions? What future is likely, and also how the trajectory toward that future would be affected by the current pandemic and associated crises?
I just want to add one thing about how to avoid conflicts, and I said that a million times in this meetings, but I think the way to avoid any conflicts in the future and now is promote the transcendent of othering and constructing larger concept of we. And I agree with one of the viewers that it will never be just one group against other, and it's never been like that. It's always coalition of different groups who collide with other coalition of different groups, and there's many interests which have to be like worked out somehow. And I think what we need is construct a meta level culture of dialogue in which different groups can engage with each other and find common grounds without erupting the war or something like that.
Yes, indeed. And it's interesting because any scenario where there's a Terran cosmist split suggests decades of prior tensions and misunderstandings and polarizations. Now, we do live in a very polarized society. It's not polarized right now along Terran cosmist lines. In some ways, the Terran cosmist dichotomy is more reasonable than the dichotomy we have today. It's more rationally understandable. The dichotomy we have today is between one assemblage of unrelated ideas that is generally characterized as the left and another assemblage of unrelated ideas that is generally characterized as the right. But it's through the influence of political consultants and mass media in their search for sensationalism that people are essentially being sorted into one tribe or another for the benefit of these special interests so that they could be more easily classified, manipulated, sold to, and persuaded to vote in certain ways. So can that kind of polarization set off a massive conflict that derails technological advancement? Rykon, what are your thoughts on that?
More or less, could you repeat the last question? I'm sorry.
So right now we do have a polarization of our society into left versus right, which isn't Terran versus cosmist, but it's driven by special interests that benefit from polarizing people and setting them against one another. So do you think that setting where people are always at each other's throats and they intentionally misunderstand one another can lead to the kind of conflict that delays the rate of technological advancement?
I personally think that I'm not saying that this is necessarily a good thing, but war has in the past actually catalyzed a lot of technological development. My honest opinion, but I believe that the space race was based on the nuclear arms race of the Cold War. Basically, we landed a man on the moon when at the height of the Cold War, when we were trying to say, hey, look, our nuclear weapons and our missiles are better than yours, Russia. And after that, we sent space probes out to other planets, but as far as manned space flight goes, we've just been playing around in low Earth orbit for a little bit, which is pretty sad, honestly, in my opinion. We should have landed a man on Mars by now, in my opinion, based on a work I've read by Robert Zubrin. I don't know if you've ever heard of his work, but he made the case that a simple rocket could go to Mars, land 4 people on the moon for about $40 billion if the US would give NASA the funding for that project. But NASA wanted to make a more expensive project to land people on Mars that would take a lot longer and use a lot more resources instead.
Yes, and I agree with you. Humankind should have landed a man on Mars by now. It's a great shame that even manned moon landings were discontinued after 1972, which was 48 years ago now, and only in this decade are there thoughts of returning to the moon. But it does seem like our society has been mired in these internal conflicts, which have distracted people from these grand technological achievements. And I agree with you too, with regard to the characterization of the Cold War as being a motivator for both the United States and the Soviet Union to expand into space as competition, in essence, and as demonstration of technological superiority. But unfortunately, what has happened with American society since that time is it has become more fractured. It has turned in on itself, and many Americans' attention, instead of being driven by these considerations of advancing technology either to show American superiority or for the benefit of humankind, is driven instead by a desire to inflict damage on another significant fraction of the American population. So I don't think it's competition or division per se that is dangerous. I think it's internal division within a society. Just as within an organization, for example, if there's internal division, the organization can't get anything done. And on the other hand, if you have two businesses and they're competing against each other, then the competition could be virtuous in the sense that each business is motivated to create better products or improve their customer service. So, David, David, what are your thoughts on this, especially because you have a NASA shirt and we're talking about some of the benefits of the competition of prior eras to NASA's ability to achieve grand projects?
Well, I think competition is key, but maybe not necessarily between just commercial firms, because now that we have Elon Musk, we have Richard Branson and others looking at commercialization aspects of low Earth orbit and on into space and onto Mars. Suddenly that's changed some things as far as governments are concerned. And we've actually seen this in the past where commercialization, take the 1800s in the United States, where people started moving west. Now they were encouraged to do that by the American government, but nevertheless, moving west took commerce with it, and it took the US Army with it as well to help protect civilians moving out that way, and also to maintain the land under the American umbrella. So now fast forward to 2020, and suddenly we have now a US Space Force. Where did that come from? Okay, there has been that element built into the Air Force for quite some time, and there was a space command for a number of years. But what really did that was the idea of commercialization of space, I believe. That also puts up other governments with their satellites, their communication systems. Our satellites and communication systems are up there. People are looking for advantages among governments, and we're going to see corporations looking for advantages among themselves. So we have kind of a cooperation, competition going on all of those elements, not even between the public and the private sector. So we have a mandate now to put Americans on the moon by a certain date. Elon Musk has said when he expects to start sending his giant spaceships to Mars. So all of this will need to follow together. We're seeing history in a more higher tech way repeat itself from a decade or from a century that has gone by. And taking this back to the book, I can imagine, I didn't read the precursor to this book, so I can't comment in detail about that, but I can see how a competition or looking at the competition can cause some of the divisiveness that led to the war in the book that ended up destroying the Earth. Why were the Terrans so fearful of the AI? They're worried about this competition. They're worried about somebody being ahead of them. They did elect to opt out of doing enhancements, but that wasn't enough. They were fearful of those who would have the enhancements. And that's where the protocol came from. And hopefully I'm characterizing that, but that's what I got from the book.
Yes, indeed. So, Rykon, would you like to comment on what in your mind led to kind of the initial chain of events that set the stage for the book? So, what would have made the Terrans so fearful and so hostile that they would take the very ironic step of destroying the Earth, given that they called themselves the Terrans, just to prevent the artilects from emerging?
Well, people in their religious or even their societal, I guess the word is zeal, have done things like kamikaze assaults where they committed suicide to destroy their enemy. So in the fervor and frenzy of war, they were so obsessed, I guess you could say they were so obsessed with destroying their enemy and keeping what they regarded as the abomination of artificial intelligence from becoming mainstream, from becoming a part of humanity, that they went to that great extent and destroyed Earth in the thought that, okay, these colonies on Mars and Ganymede will preserve natural humanity as we want it to be. That's what the Terrans did in my book.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, these Terrans have become so fanatical that they would destroy even much of what they themselves value just to eliminate what they perceive to be as a threat. And, you know, this brings parallels in my mind to how a lot of terrorist groups operate. Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, for example, or like some of the deep green environmentalist terrorists, think Ted Kaczynski, for example, they have no qualms about taking out innocent people. They have no qualms about even taking out people who might agree with them, because they would see that as just regrettable collateral damage. But they are so single-minded in their view that modern society is a threat, or America is a threat, or technology is a threat, that they would stop at nothing to eliminate that threat. Now, fortunately, these terrorists are a small minority of the population, and generally they're less skilled and less competent than most decent humans, and thus they can be thwarted through technology, as well as through military and security systems. But is there a risk that there could be some fringe terrorist faction that essentially does what the Terrans did in your book, even if the majority of society would be opposed to that and would be fine with these advanced technologies? What do you think?
Well, in my story, I'm actually writing the sequel. Galatea is the sequel to Erendite that I'm in the middle of writing right now. But in that one, Perron, the main character, goes to Earth and in search of a counterpart for Erendite to restore that aspect of the divided artificial intelligence, kind of a complicated scenario that's actually described at the end of Erendite. but the Artilect divided itself into 3 parts, and the sequel, Perron, is on Earth looking for a second Artilect. And on that journey, he's finding old files and stuff throughout Earth, throughout the radioactive wastelands of Earth, that give him clues as to a lot of the mysterious events that happened during the Artilect War. So it kind of gives you a picture of what happened during the Artilect War. And I'll go ahead and say that it's kind of a spoiler, but not really. So I'll go ahead and say that. The Iron Curtain of the Cold War was effectively reestablished. 2 sides of the world warring against each other. Japan, in the Tokyo Institute of Technology, was the center of the cosmist power. America and Europe was the center of the Terran power at the beginning of the war. The Terrans almost won right before the cosmists created the Artilect, which completely turned the tide of the war in a very short period of time. So the Terrans in this case were quite powerful. I don't imagine a couple small terror cells. I mean, to be quite honest, we're basically, our military is kind of in control of a lot of things over in the Middle East right now. A lot of people don't have a strong opinion on this issue, but a lot of people believe we're just over there warring for oil and resources with the excuse of fighting terrorism.
Well, thank you for providing us with a preview of your second novel, as well as some of the events that preceded the first novel. So that would be quite interesting to read when it's available. And that does give background as to some of the events in this Terran Cosmos War that predated the destruction of Earth. Now, it's interesting, too, that you posit Japan as the home of the cosmist movement, and then the United States and Europe as the center of the Terran reaction. And we've had conversations before about how transhumanism or technology in general are perceived in Japanese culture. Denise Renson, who is our foreign ambassador in Japan, stated essentially the Japanese don't have the same dichotomy between nature and technology that Westerners do. They see technology as being part of life and part of nature. And so they don't have the same aversion to robotics, for example. They very readily embrace robots, and they don't have the same idea that medical life extension is unnatural. So Japan is one of the most technologically advanced societies. There's not the same explicit concept of transhumanism there, though, that there is in the West. In the West, we have a lot more, let's say, fragmentation in terms of cultural views of longevity, technological enhancement. On the one hand, the United States is the epicenter of the transhumanist movement in the world still. We are by far the most advanced country, both in terms of the biomedical research itself, as well as the, let's say, cultural awareness that this is a transformational set of forces. But on the other hand, there are so many factions within our country that would resist these ideas as well. And in every country, there's still a large swath of the population that is just unaware of the possibilities. But I'm curious, in your mind, what led you to associate Europe and the US with the Terrans and Japan with the Cosmists?
Well, growing up, I just always liked anime as a kid. Plus, I'm aware that Japan has a lot of robots, so I kind of placed Japan at the center of that. And also, America has a lot of people, I guess I would say, misusing scripture to demonize technology and technological advancements. Not that any technophobic statements are even in any way justified by religious scripture, but at the same time, a lot of Christians in America today and a large fraction of the American population is that type of religious fanatic. A lot of people in the West might more likely have that aversion to technology than people in the East, is what I was thinking.
Very interesting. So what are the thoughts of the other panelists on this? What countries in the future are more likely to be aligned with supporting advanced technology, and where in the world would much of the resistance, if any, come from?
I was mainly writing a fiction novel to entertain. I wouldn't say I have an expert opinion or anything on that.
Okay, any others who might have a view in terms of differential perceptions of technology throughout the world today? Is there any country where we could see a large Terran resistance, or are they all going to gradually adapt to the new technologies?
Gennady, the Russian transhumanist would disagree with you that center of the transhumanist activity in the US. Because I think not in a total number, but how many transhumanists per capita the Russia, I think, would compete with US very good. But in terms of which country, I think none of the country will be, so to say, the host of the transhumanist movement, some centralized transhumanist movement. I think transhumanists will grow their chapters all around the world, and they will try to convert other countries into the transhumanism or immortalism, or at least optimistic futurism. And I think this network of transhumanists will transcend the traditional way the world organized in countries, and it will just make the country division obsolete.
Yes, very interesting. And I will say this international mode of outreach and collaboration is one that the US Transhumanist Party has very much embraced with its foreign ambassador program, with the allied membership possibility, where about 30% of our members are outside the United States. I'm not aware of any other political party that does that. Now, the Russian transhumanist movement, of course, is quite prominent as well. And in Russia, there is a long history of these ideas dating back to the Russian cosmist movement. The obstacles they have there are a bit different from ours in the sense of, let's say, the authoritarian political climate getting in the way of meaningfully spreading these ideas. In our case, we have obstacles in the political climate as well, but it's more of this two-party polarization that is standing in our way. So a different set of problems, but it is interesting to see transhumanism kind of take on various flavors throughout the world. I would be curious if it may be possible in the coming decade to achieve, let's say, tighter collaboration between the US and Russian transhumanist movements. Right now, they've kind of both been absorbed in dealing with these unique political problems that they're faced with. Is there a possibility for kind of a transnational collaboration that occurs in spite of these different circumstances?
I'm sure it is. I have lots of contacts in Russian transhumanist circles. I was in leadership of the Russian transhumanist movement in the beginning of the 2000s and 2010s. So, and they're still very active and very diverse. And I believe that the possibility of collaboration between Russian and non-Russian and US, any transhumanist movements all around the world is endless. Just we need to spend some effort, put some effort into the communication. First of all, into the communication, at least we have to know each other, that we exist, we are there, because usually we don't know that we all are there. And yeah, I think the possibilities are endless.
Excellent. Well, hopefully that is something that can be achieved going forward. Now, Jason Geringer makes an interesting observation. He says, quote, I think those countries where oil is central to their economy will be behind other countries. And then Anathar Frost says, quote, I could see resistance coming from anywhere a religious hierarchy is somewhat in power, who would feel transhumanism would somehow threaten their authority. So one country that comes to mind with that is Iran. Iran actually fits both categories. It's an oil rich power, and it has a religious hierarchy at the top. Now, I'm curious how others on this panel would anticipate Iran responding to transhumanism. What would be the likelihood of acceptance of some of these enhancements versus resistance in that kind of country?
Well, I'll jump in and say that I'll take the side that, yeah, I think they would not be in favor of it, primarily based on their traditional past. Going back to the comment from Jason, the idea about countries with oil, as well as the religious, are countries that have a lot to lose by change. So transhumanism by its very nature is change for the better, but change affects any society that loses by having that change. So Iran would clearly fall into that, and in some aspects, the United States falls into that. We manage technology in certain areas to our advantage, and probably would be less interested in supporting technology that we didn't see to our advantage. I suspect Russia and China as other major players that would follow suit as well. So your original comment of what countries would be against, or where we wouldn't see this come from, and I was thinking, of the permanent member countries that sit at the United Nations. They have had their, they sit in those permanent seats in part to make sure that change doesn't happen too fast and that they can control what change that happens. So I would expect to see that going forward. Now, flipping this around, what countries might surprise us, or might maybe not surprise us in this group because we're paying attention, but surprise society at large, that could be at the forefront of a transhumanist future. And the first one that comes to my mind is little Estonia. Estonia has done great things as far as digitizing their economy, their voting. They're in the process of using AI judges for very common matters, things that are essentially driven by table type intelligence, except because they have the limitations of manpower and money. Why not put this into kind of an automated mode? And then the results of any of these can be overseen by a human judge if someone wishes to contest that. But I would predict that because of the acceptance that's gone on in Estonia so far with what they've implemented, that I think those challenges would be probably few. So I could see a case where Estonia could surpass many of the more what we consider to be technologically advanced nations, and maybe lead us into the singularity, or at least the fruit of the singularity. I'm interested in Charlie's comment on that. It's kind of my idea of the singularity expert. Go ahead, Charlie.
I know I agree with you on Estonia. They're definitely ahead of the curve in a lot of respects. And I had the pleasure of meeting Jan Tallinn years ago at a conference. He's the guy who invented Skype, or he was one of them. So they're way advanced, and if we can emulate them in this country, that'd be great. I think as far as um, a war over technology isn't necessarily what's going to happen. I mean, when you think about the wars that have occurred in the past, it was it's usually a religious or an ideological difference. It's not necessarily about the technology. We all embraced, when there was in the olden days, we had wars, everybody used guns, and in the future, everybody had their nuclear weapons. There was never an argument about the technology. It was always an argument about something what you believe. But we all embrace the technology and try to use it to our advantage. So I don't see, especially friendly technology, like what we're talking about, where you can better a person. I mean, who's going to go to war over advanced cell phones? Like, we're really not going to stop. We're not going to go to war. So I think the idea that this like what's happening with COVID, it's unfortunate, but it's not going to be something that's going to derail the trajectory of the singularity. As Ray Kurzweil pointed out in his books, and he puts into his graphs, you can see that some of the major catastrophes, if you want to call it that, like World War I and World War II, did not alter the trajectory of the doubling of our technologies over a period of time, and I don't see that changing even with this COVID situation. In fact, there are some things, as Gennady pointed out earlier, that are being advanced, because of COVID, where you're having people now being forced to use, like we're doing now, being online a lot more than we ever thought, and people becoming familiarized with that. I think as far as, as far as the idea of us getting, used to different technologies for our betterment, I think that's just going to happen. So I if you're asking me about the singularity and where that's going, I don't see any change as far as these things that are happening. I think, and as far as like countries that have oil, a lot of those countries, they're so wealthy, they're just putting their money into green energy technologies. It's not like they're going to sit there and just say, well, I guess oil's obsolete, so we're out of money. They're cleverly buying up a lot of companies that are doing green energy. As far as a country like Iran goes, it's a generational situation. Look at what happened with that spring uprising that happened years ago, where they were using technology like Twitter and so forth to organize a way to try to advance a revolution. I think when the older religious people die off, the young people are not going to necessarily adhere to such strict draconian ways of their leaders that might be there now. So I think these changes they're going to come, and the conflicts won't be as heavy as we think, because it's all for the betterment of society, and eventually people will just start to say, yeah, okay, let's go with this.
Very interesting comments, both from David and Charlie, and there are some observations in the chat as well that are relevant to this. So Mike DeVerde says, aren't Saudi Arabia under their prince and the United Arab Emirates trying to pour oil revenue into alternative advanced technology? That's what you were mentioning, Charlie. And then user Mike the God Killer says that Saudi Arabia made Sophia the robot as a citizen of that nation. And that is correct. Actually, Saudi Arabia was the first nation in the world to declare a robot to be a citizen, which is interesting. So it is, let's say, a mixed situation where in some cases there would be an incentive to try to hold on to the status quo. In other cases, there would be an incentive for some of these governments to try to intentionally show that they are innovative, that they're trying to move away from dependence on oil. But on the other hand, I can see the micronations and smaller countries like Estonia also emerging to play a role in this because they have the most to gain from these advanced technologies. So, Art Ramon, do you have any comments on this conversation regarding which countries would be more inclined to adopt these technologies and where the resistance would come from?
I think in Ghana, with a lot of Chinese investment and people who aren't bound by what they have now, and they can just take a leap forward. You know, they don't have to worry about building out infrastructure. We can build out the body. And yeah, I would keep an eye on Ghana. Is what I would keep an eye on.
Yes, interesting, very interesting. And yes, indeed, we will be monitoring developments in Ghana more carefully. Now, also, I'm reminded of the outreach project that the US Transhumanist Party initiated several months ago with regard to the government of Argentina, trying to convince them to declare aging a disease. And there could be interest in other countries as well for a similar declaration if the leadership of those countries would recognize that this is a way to attract investment, it would be a way to attract attention from the scientific community, and a way to position those countries to be more at the forefront of innovation. And smaller countries like Liechtenstein, which has been quite active in the cryptocurrency space, for example, or San Marino, would be interesting candidates for that kind of declaration as well. So since we've been talking about oil and alternative energy, I wonder if John Carrots, our Director of Energy Issues, has anything to say on these questions. Let's see.
I hadn't been thinking much about the energy, but I was curious. I was interested in the idea of the different countries and the differences like we talked about before. I myself have often thought when man's technology increases and we also spread out into space more, I often thought that the world as a whole would polarize against the other groups, not have divisions within itself. But I thought that might not polarize, I'm saying it should be unify. And that we would probably be like the people living on the moon and people in Mars and people in the asteroid belts, and we would feel it was us against them, and the different groups would group that way instead of countries viewing differently. But you know, at the same time that a planet could group together and feel different views to people out on the other planets and stuff, I'm sure there would be subdivisions. But I think something that this made me think heavily about is the fact that just like the Wild West, technology will be divided, I think. I think the people living in what you would refer to now as the big cities of the Wild West would have that better technology. And the people further out in the outer reaches would have technology that would probably just be minimal to get them by. And it would kind of be the haves and the have-nots, but they'd have enough technology to get them by where they were, which at this time might seem superior to what we have, but I think there will definitely be a difference and a division between who has higher technology and who has lower. And the people out there at the further reaches will probably have minimal of just what they need to get by to, because they're going to be the ones that are kind of, like I said, in the Wild West, in the out fringes of stuff. And that'll be the same way with energy and all technology, I think.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and say that I think that's a great observation, John. And as you were talking, you reminded me of something else. Last night I was out walking here in Phoenix. Very clear skies, great for stargazing. And Saturn and Jupiter, especially Jupiter, were very bright in the sky last night. And I was thinking about the Salon today, and having read the book, I was thinking how interesting this is, because today when I think about what goes on in Russia, what goes on in Estonia, or pick any other handful of countries, there are places on a map, there are places that I see online perhaps, and I may be lucky enough to travel there, but that's a major endeavor. But what would it be like to look up in the sky and go, those 2 points of light have people just like me. In this case, on moons around those, I see Mars in the sky at night. And of course, we all see the moon at night. And I wonder how that will change us as we go forward. Sure, we'll look at the planet, civilizations that are further away from the sun will have more energy issues just because that power drops off at an inverse square rate. So by the time we're getting out to Jupiter and Saturn, that's greatly depleted from what we can do here with solar energy. So to John's point, yeah, they will have perhaps to have different technologies to be able to survive at that level. Nevertheless, they should be able to look up in their night sky, hopefully, and see something called Earth and perhaps Mars. And we'll be able to see each other. We'll be able to see distant civilizations that we've never been able to see while we've been here on planet Earth. So I'm bringing that up now because the book actually put those thoughts into my head. I think this is the power of science fiction. This is the power of talking about transhumanism in narratives like that. It opens up me and perhaps others to a different way of thinking that hopefully could be more inclusive for the future.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And actually, this conversation brought to my mind, but also brought to another person's mind, yet another science fiction work. It's The Expanse, which is a series on Amazon Prime. And in connection with that, Mike the God Killer writes, quote, "Well, we don't want a future that is like the Amazon Prime series, The Expanse, where the human race starts becoming racist based on being born on Mars or asteroids or being born on Earth." So in that series, actually, over centuries, because of the harsh conditions as well as the different gravity settings in various space colonies, people begin to diverge from one another evolutionarily. And the people who live in the space colonies and low gravity, they actually would have a hard time coming back to Earth and living there. So there is a greater segmentation among humans based on biology than exists today. And The Expanse isn't exactly a transhumanist type of future in the sense that a lot of these changes occur more gradually. There's not as much of a concept of accelerating technological advancement in that universe as compared to those which do contemplate the power of transhumanist technologies, including advanced artificial intelligence. But what John pointed out reminded me of that kind of outcome as well, where people kind of begin to sort themselves not based on what country they are from or other circumstantial attributes that may vary among people on Earth, but rather what planet they're from and the factors of that planet which might influence human biology or human possibilities going forward. But with regard to transhuman technologies and enhancements, do you think those could counteract that kind of polarization? Like if everybody had enhancements that allowed them to function with whatever amount of gravity was present, could that once again increase the level of similarity as opposed to the level of difference among humans? Any thoughts on that? What about Pavel?
Sorry. Well, I think it's still a division, the same like division between countries. Like if you divide people who was born in one planet and another, in the same the way of othering, like between countries. And if you go beyond, like we start dividing the some entities who was born in different galaxies, and they will divide them, build some division between themselves just because of the fact that they from Andromeda and from Milky Way.
Yes. So, Charlie, what are your thoughts on this? Could these future divisions form, or would transhumanism have the ability to keep people more or less united by the fact that we can all enhance our capabilities?
Yes, we're all going to be united by our capabilities. I was just laughing when Pavel mentioned a different galaxy. I thought, wow, we're jumping pretty far out to the future. It's one thing to be colonizing Mars. It's another thing to another galaxy. It's going to take a little bit longer. No, you know, here's the problem. Here's what I see. The biggest difference we have right now, right, in our humanity, and we tend to be so human centric when we address problems in the future. We take what's going on now and we project it onto what's going to happen in the future, which is kind of just, again, it's human centric. We can't help ourselves. That was the case with Star Trek. I mean, the idea that there's this, you know, spaceship flying around the the universe with humans that are aging, they're getting old looking, and but they're going to another planet, and then the planet has green people. You know, we can't help it. We're humans, and we like to project these ideas. But if you start to think like a transhumanist, as Ray Kurzweil writes in his books about what we're going to face, once we start changing and we start to merge with technology, as predicted by so many of our futurist friends, the differences won't be there. I mean, when we have an economy of abundance, for example, because some of the biggest differences we have right now are socioeconomic, right? I mean, that's really what's the division. That's why there's protests and riots, because there's a socioeconomic division that goes on. We don't treat people that are poor in the same way that we treat people that are rich. But if there's an economy of abundance and everybody can have what they need, and then we have a merging of technology where our brains are a lot smarter and we think a lot faster, and then we have things like virtual reality, and probably because of things like quantum entanglement, we won't even have delays if people are living on Mars and Earth. So, you know, we'll be able to, it'll be as if they're standing right next to us. Then there's going to be other kinds of technologies like instant translation of languages. So we won't even have that kind of division. So as we merge with technology, we'll become much more uniform around the world. And if we do go to other planets, then we'll be uniform with them as well. And those people in those planets will have probably the highest forms of technology because that's how they'll need it to survive. And it's interesting that, and it's maybe prescient to think about this. There's a joke. It says like, oh, are you aware that the scientists are aware of a planet that's completely inhabited by robots? Well, that's Mars, you know, because the rovers are technically robots, right? I mean, it tells you something that, you know, to survive on those planets, it might be better if we are merged with technologies or we have robotic bodies so that we aren't affected by radiation or poor gravity or all the things that we need to survive. So there's a lot of things that are coming because of technology and the advances of technology that are going to change the very fundamental version of what it is to be human, if we even want to call it that. That's why we call it transhuman, right? So we have to keep in mind that these technologies that are going to transform society so greatly that it's hard to say, and it's wrong almost to say like, well, we see the division of the poor and the rich, and we're just going to extrapolate that onto what's going to come in the future. If we merge, and as a society, it looks like we will, because that's one way to defeat death, then when we merge with these technologies, it's going to be so different that it brings us back to what we started this conversation in the beginning about the idea the singularity reaches us. It's almost hard to predict what's going to come about next. You know, it's really difficult to say when the singularity hits. and it comes to the point of doubling our technologies instantaneously, and we can apply those to our society, how we're going to live. It's really hard to fathom that, except we can look at trajectories and see that even if you look back over hundreds of years, you see that society is getting better. I mean, we have clean water, much more abundant. We have, people are not dying from starvation as much as they're dying from obesity now because of the plentifulness of what we have. So the trajectory of the benefits are there, and we see that it's coming, and the singularity is coming. So we have to really start to look at humanity in a much broader way and try to incorporate all these technologies so we'll have a true idea of where we're going. So sorry for being long-winded, but you know, now that I'm a politician apparently running for president.
Cam for president. Cam for president.
That's what I say.
Yes, indeed. Cam 2020. Let's get the message out to as many constituencies as possible. And I think, Charlie, you did a great job with your remarks just now, especially pointing out how advanced technology can unify humankind and overcome all of these divisions over resources, over status. So Rykon, what are your thoughts in regard to this conversation? Do you think there will be divisions among different kinds of humans based on where they settle and what the environments of those worlds would be? Or would transhuman technologies be able to bridge those gaps and enable people to all have the kind of functionality needed to survive and prosper in those environments?
I think division between us, I mean, I think we'll essentially have peace with each other, but I mean, most wars are based on resource scarcity. But I think whether or not we're divided with each other based on distance is obviously based on whether or not there's a loophole to the speed of light. So if we can develop warp drive, then no. If we don't develop warp drive, then yes, we'll be divided based on different solar systems. Mm-hmm. I wrote speaking of, you were talking about the future of space travel and stuff, going to different galaxies earlier. I have a collection of about 16 short stories anybody can read for free on Wattpad, as well as the novel I published. One of them is about a ship at the end of the universe. The heat death of the universe is when all galaxies die out, and basically all that's left are the black hole, very ancient black holes at the center of the galaxies. Eventually those will evaporate because of Hawking radiation. So there's a ship called, the story's called Out of Nothing, by the way, if anybody wants to read that. And it's about a ship that survived after the death of the last black holes. It's riding through basically empty space, collecting hydrogen and using a transfuser to make all of the elements it needs through a process of nuclear fusion and diffusion. And it's out of nothing because they have to find a way to create matter out of nothing to reverse the flow of entropy in order to create a world to completely extend their life to literal eternity.
So the story is called Out of Nothing. And where can one find this compilation of short stories?
It's wattpad.com/user/Rykon Volta.
Wattpad.com, that's wattpad.com/user/Rykon Volta, spelled all together?
Yep.
All right, well, as soon as I'm able to access the link, which is right now, I will post it in the chat So wattpad.com/user/Rykon Volta is where readers will be able to find Out of Nothing, as well as your other short stories. And I also have the link for Out of Nothing, which I have shared in the chat right now. So anyone who's interested in the science fiction writings of Rykon Volta, please check that out. Now, you pointed out warp drive, essentially any type of faster than light travel would be needed to keep humankind in constant communication and sharing of technologies once human habitation spreads out that far. And of course, to make a sizable difference to the future of the universe, human habitation would eventually need to spread out that far. Now, this will be a much more advanced future in the sense that there would be more enhancements to the human form, as well as much more advanced space travel than we have right now. But does anyone on the panel still think there's a possibility of distance being the factor that leads various human or transhuman societies to diverge, so that if it takes 100 years to communicate with another colony, that colony will take its own path, and perhaps a few millennia later, if there's additional contact, we'll find that the inhabitants of that world have gone in a completely different direction. Any thoughts on that?
Well, they definitely, if the lag between the messages like 100 years, the culture is definitely going to evolve in their own way, even if they start from the same basis. And maybe like one culture will send the message and other culture would not respond because they transcend their the default settings and they just go beyond singularity and they become something else, which can but not interested to talk their biological ancestors.
So yes, some interesting possibilities could arise on those kinds of scales of time and distance. We've seen it with geographically separated human societies over the centuries, how there was essentially a divergent development. So even if there was some occasional contact in the days before railroads or air travel, you would have very distinct cultures emerging, and they would take different paths. But it's interesting to think about how technology affects that. Right now, we live in a world where communication is nearly instantaneous with people anywhere on Earth, as long as they have certain technologies. And that has the potential to bring us together, to bring in many people into the same conversations and start building that cultural context. I've spoken to a group of MBA students in Nigeria just 3 days ago. And I told them essentially some of the challenges that arise in human relations these days are due to the fact that historically humans have been so fragmented, and in different societies, development kind of took its own path, and different cultures form different assumptions about communication. And now, especially because of this pandemic, geographical distance doesn't mean as much anymore. So we are all essentially now in one common pool of people who are communicating various ideas to one another. And as a result, we come into contact with many more people who are different from ourselves, but we need to build that shared context, given that these interactions are so new. So that's a situation where technology actually brings people together and enables previously distinct cultures to start creating a shared culture. It also brings to mind one way to avert future conflicts if we start seeing all of humankind as one culture, including our development of advanced technologies as being part of our future growth. What are everyone's thoughts about that?
Well, I think that I wonder if there's something just innate in human beings that want to be a little bit different. Because as I've traveled and lived a lot of places across the United States, and then in other English-speaking countries, even with the internet, even with distribution of American films and literature and so forth, these other places hang on to what makes them uniquely different, even if we're all speaking English. So when I travel to New Zealand, or if you travel into, say, like the UK, or even just across the border to Canada, quite clearly there are differences that people hang on to, even though we find it very easy to share. And then even within our own borders, if you spend time in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, it's quite a different experience, say, from New York or New Jersey. And then once again, moving out here to the west, Nevada, where you're at, Gennady, or Arizona, where Art and I are at, are quite different, even from California, which is not all that far away. And then I think I heard that, Rykon, I think you are in the Washington area, is that right? So I lived up in the Seattle area, and I found that to be, decidedly different than, say, Idaho, which is not that far away. So
I'm in Tennessee now, actually, but I was in
okay.
Washington. I was in Washington until about March. I had to move for family reasons.
Okay. But I'm just saying that even across the United States, it can still be quite different. So I don't say that to say that we shouldn't work together and that technology won't bring us together, but perhaps it will only bring us so far, and we'll still keep various flavors from where we're at. And we can extrapolate that to going to the moon and going to Mars and going to other places. And that may be good because it creates a common understanding and perhaps creates a little bit of flavor so that we're not all the same thing, even though I'm sure I'll have to go visit a Walmart on Mars at some point in the future.
Hey, I've been meaning to, there's a book called Zero Sum Capitalism. I haven't fully read the book. It suggests that capitalism will make eventually resources so abundant and cheap. Well, as technology makes resources abundant, the price, free market capitalism will drive the price down. Like the way new technology, when it first comes out, it's pretty expensive. Then as it becomes more advanced, it also becomes cheaper. That's the general trend of technology. The suggestion of zero-sum capitalism, I believe, is that capitalism will eventually drive itself into obsolescence as resources become so abundant that they're practically free.
So, Charlie, that parallels a lot of what you've said previously. Do you agree that this is the trajectory toward the future where essentially through the dynamic of free market capitalism, we'll have enough abundance that eventually almost everything people would want would be basically free and obtainable without money?
Yes. If you want me to elaborate, I can. Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. Yes, of course. I think that's the trajectory we're on. I think it's going to change a lot of things. We are going to have an abundance economy, and there's going to be, with regard to what Dave was saying, with regard to some of the differences that we have. It is interesting that we do have those kinds of differences, but let's not forget also that if we merge with these technologies, not only having robotic bodies, but we're going to merge with our brains so that we'll have this brain interface so that we can have all the knowledge that ever existed into our brains, which would essentially make us much smarter. And we'll probably have some kind of chip or nanobot that will also have our ability to analyze things, like an analysis bot or something, so we can think millions of times faster. And once we have all that type of information within us, then the idea of differences between people would be obsolete as well, because then that means you'll know everything there is possibly to know about everybody. So it's what brings us together, and we'll appreciate those fun differences. But it's also going to be a reason why we shouldn't think that we're going to have such differences that we will be at odds with each other. I mean, when we have all that kind of new technology embraced into our bodies in some way, and it's coming, then we will have a society that's going to get along. The idea of abundance will be, as you asked about that with regard to capitalism, yeah, that's going to make capitalism obsolete. It is from the book that Rykon mentioned, Zero Sum.
So this is quite an interesting future where a lot of, let's say, the involuntary differences are transcended, but what David suggested was that people would still choose certain ways to distinguish themselves as individuals, or if they perceive aspects of their background, their experiences, their social groups, which are distinctive, they'll still emphasize those, but it would be more of kind of a chosen set of differences, and the choices may vary among individuals too. So some people might embrace aspects from a prior culture. Other people might choose to take on aspects of a completely different culture, or make their own, perhaps. I'm reminded, for instance, there are many Westerners who are fond of anime, and so they adapt aspects of Japanese culture, even though people from Japan would probably think these people aren't quite getting it. So I wonder if that will occur more frequently, where people in the future just decide, okay, I like these elements of this particular culture, so I'm going to adapt them and make them part of my own expression, but I'm not necessarily bound by that. I could choose something different if I want. So a kind of very hyper-pluralistic future where people don't inextricably associate themselves with their origins, so to speak, but rather take on a cultural identity as individuals. What does everyone think about that? Let's see. How about Art Ramon? Any comments about culture in the future?
I think in the future, everyone's going to branch out into their even smaller niches. And yeah, everyone's going to have that choice to be what they want to be. Freedom of anthropomorphic freedom will go along with that. And yeah, I don't see any hindrance to that. It's going to be a natural choice that everyone is going to create even more subcultures. If you're into any type of music genre, you know how the music genres have just continued to fragment and develop even more versions of what used to be. I remember when electronica back in the early 90s, and now what electronica is now is just fragmented and become even more niche and continue to evolve. So the same thing with human culture. It's going to continue to just keep spreading and evolving.
Yes, indeed. And Anathar Frost says, well, from a technical standpoint, that's what America is supposed to be, the whole melting pot thing. And I'm inclined to agree. Essentially, in America, at the very founding, the premise was you don't have to be bound by your culture of origin. You can choose to accept a society that's based on certain explicit principles. And if you adhere to those principles, then you can participate in this society. And that was the first time that a country was founded on that premise, as opposed to just some group of people who happen to be biologically related settling together and over time gradually becoming a country. So that is an idea that was first instantiated in history within the United States. Alexandria Black says, Japanese Elvis impersonators still get a giggle from me. So another example of cultural influences going the other way. So the Japanese seeing aspects of American culture that they wish to adopt. And this, in some circles, it's derided as so-called cultural appropriation, but really it's been happening throughout history. And these aspects of different cultures have spread. In the past, they've spread more slowly because they would have had to be carried across on a ship or via caravan. And now they can be downloaded from the internet. So it's easier for people to become aware of what other cultures are like and to decide that they like something from another culture and adapt it. But maybe they don't adapt the entirety of that other culture. So they might not always understand how it was originally used or applied. They may apply it in a different way. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as it's done in a constructive way, as long as it doesn't result in harm to any group of people, and in most cases it wouldn't. So I'm not of the view that, quote, cultural appropriation is something heinous. I think it's just the way in which cultures interact and have interacted historically, and there's no arbitrary line that we can draw to say that, oh, this is some point in time at which a culture is fully formed and now you can't mess with it. Quite the contrary, our cultures indeed are evolving at an accelerating rate. So Rykon, do you have any thoughts on that?
On how cultures are evolving in an accelerating way?
Yeah.
I kind of agree with Art Ramon that we'll just evolve into our own niches and sort of create our own individual experience. I imagine that a lot of culture is very conformist. It tells you to live like everybody else lives, or you go into clique and they tell you how to live. I think a lot of people will just kind of dive into their own niches when they no longer are as dependent upon society, maybe. Like, more people will start to live off the grid, start being self-sufficient, start providing their own energy. They'll have more efficient ways with like 3D printing and robotics to grow their own food. So I think culture will start to dissipate in favor of individuals defining their own personal culture.
Yes, self-defined culture, I think, is an important phenomenon to consider. I very much believe that I've created my own culture for myself, and I would encourage other people to consider doing that as well. And that means taking the best of what they see all around them or what they seek out deliberately, and essentially figuring out what works well for you as an individual. So that is definitely a phenomenon that is ongoing. And I hope that it can counteract the pressures toward conformity that are still all too widespread. Any other panelists' thoughts on the development of culture, adaptation of different cultural elements, and individual culture?
Well, I see the future of culture is more diverse. I see that it's going to be like meta level of the big culture within which we'll have gazillion different cultural tribes which play different narratives. Like we have a different people who are going to be, I don't know, reenact some medieval battles. People who are going to play with Ghost and Shell and reenact the heroic action of Matoka Kusanagi, and people will play the different tribes, and people will be able to play one tribe and then tomorrow go play another tribe. and they should be no like repercussions for changing narratives, and technology allow us to play more and more realistic and deep simulations, and I think this cultural tribe game simulation will be able to replace, not entirely, but replace big portion of the what we call reality, uh, and so we will be in this we will be deep playing these different narratives.
Now, indeed, it seems like that sort of situation is emerging. But at the same time, while we have these different cultures, subcultures within a larger culture, we also do still inhabit a shared physical reality. And we have certain needs as human beings, the need to survive, the need for food, for shelter. And it's also interesting to consider how in this cultural cross communication, individuation, but also this increasingly complex interplay of subcultures, humans can still remain focused on the needs within the shared reality, especially when it comes to overcoming the issues that afflict us all, like death and disease. Do you think it's possible to get all of the subcultures from whatever source they may originate to understand the desirability of these goals, which are broadly speaking the goals of transhumanism, and work toward those goals, each in their own way, so that people come to recognize whatever literature, computer games, music, clothing, food that you favor, these are still the most important objectives, and we need to solve these problems if we're going to be able to enjoy whatever cultural products we choose to enjoy. So any thoughts on that? Charlie, what about you? Do you think we can get humankind to unite on these kinds of goals despite cultural differences?
Yeah, definitely. It also, we have to determine what we define by culture. If it's a matter of language or music or food or dance or certain belief systems, all of those things tend to evolve over time within the cultures, and a lot of it depends on certain technology, obviously, right? I mean, and the idea of cultural appropriation, I don't know if the word appropriation is right, but the idea that we already do that. I mean, we've done that with food. I mean, in the United States, I love going to have Thai food or something like that. Which I maybe a couple hundred years ago you wouldn't even had that option. So I think that there's going to be all sorts of differences, but at the same time, we are going to develop our virtual technologies, and full immersion virtual technology with haptic abilities is going to make the idea of seeing what it's like to be in those other cultures very easily accessible to everyone on the planet at some point. So the idea of cultural differences is fun and interesting. I mean, I love going and finding out new foods or different cultures or what they're all about. But I do think that you're going to have, because of technology, there's going to be access to all these cultures readily available to everyone all the time. Just like with the shutdown, I find myself watching a lot more television than I ever would have. And now I'm watching shows from countries all over the world that I probably never would have otherwise. But it just goes to show you that technology allowed that even in this form, with regard to television. And even that wasn't the case years ago, where there was only 3 channels in the United States. So culture is something that's fun, it's exciting, and it's going to be accessible by everybody. So I do think there's going to be it's going to have a unification because of the fact of technology, where we get to experience everybody else's cultures.
Yes, thank you, Charlie. And Mike, the God Killer, says, "Amen, Charlie. I love lots of different foods too." And he wants to get to the point where humans can eat only for pleasure and not the need for survival. Perhaps we'll be taking a pill that provides us all of our daily nutritional needs, exactly custom tailored to our individual biology. And food could be this kind of experience like on the Star Trek holodeck, where we would have the haptic tools to essentially enable us to taste the food, but we wouldn't be taking in the calories from that. So Anathar Frost says true food is one thing that does tend to cross cultural boundaries, that as well as music. So it's interesting how that could be a gateway into venturing into different cultures and understanding them a bit. Now, one other subject I wanted to broach within this panel discussion is advocacy for rights of sentient entities. And we discussed that in last weekend's Salon with Cyborg Dre as well. But this idea of a future of either human machine integration or conflict among different factions within society with regard to their views on that prospect raises the question of, can any of these transitions go more smoothly if we articulate frameworks for sentient rights sooner rather than later? For instance, the Transhumanist Bill of Rights version 3.0, which is the most advanced document I'm aware of for discussing this. If we bring these kinds of considerations to the forefront of the discussion now, even a few decades before we might have an artificial general intelligence, do you think future societies will not see this as a major source of friction, that they would have more of a mindset that, yes, we've anticipated that this was going to come, we've prepared for this, so now it's coming, all right, now we get to apply these ideas?
Well, perhaps it won't be an intellectual adventure. It will be for some, clearly those in the academic community. But I think for the typical person, it's going to be what they experience and think of as artificial intelligence on a daily basis. Is there something that helps them pay their bills? Is it something that helps them with transportation? Perhaps it's artificial intelligence in the workplace. Many times we make that a either or thing. Artificial intelligence is going to put us out of work. Well, maybe artificial intelligence will expand the kind of work. But just like we were talking about earlier, having different cultures talk to each other, get to know each other, and break down barriers, we can apply that same thing to artificial intelligence. If artificial intelligence becomes our friend, it becomes our workmate, it becomes our helper, then I think we're much less likely to see it as a threat than we would be otherwise.
Yes, thank you very much, David, for those remarks. And I agree, with more familiarity, with more integration of artificial intelligence into our lives, it will be seen as less of a threat. Now, it will still be quite interesting to figure out where is that boundary between which we use AI as tools and the other side where we recognize the AI as co-equal to us in a certain extent. Either it's integrated with us, in which case we're still the entities that bear rights, or if there is some sort of separate intelligent entity, at what point do we draw the line and say this is more than a tool? Say a Mr. Data kind of situation, where in the Star Trek universe, Mr. Data was ultimately recognized as having the right to exist as an autonomous entity. And I'm wondering, Rykon, if you have any thoughts on that. So let's say there's an Artilect, and do you think that human societies are going to be readily willing to grant rights to the Artilect, or will there be resistance? Let's see.
Your screen just froze for a moment, so I did not hear what you just said.
All right, so if there is an Artilect that is developed, do you think human societies will readily grant rights to that Artilect, or will there be significant resistance, not with regard to seeing the Artilect as evil and something that needs to be destroyed, but seeing it as a tool, something that humans should control and direct, and that wouldn't have its own autonomous agency recognized?
I think the way a lot of AI developers speak today, the first AIs are probably going to be looked at as tools, but I think there very well might have to be a civil rights movement for artificial intelligence.
Yes, a civil rights movement for artificial intelligence is a possibility in the future. Now, the purpose of the Transhumanist Bill of Rights is to anticipate that and make that more of a mild discussion that happens in the future rather than a social upheaval. Now, I'm wondering, everyone else on the panel, what do you think is the probability of any sort of social upheaval over these issues? Is it a high probability, or is it a low probability, even given the mindsets that we observe in the status quo? And I'll preface this by saying some people have difficulty accepting other humans today. And there was a comment in the chat as well about children's rights not being fully recognized today. Will Mangarini says, we don't even give many rights to children. We don't trust them to know what's best for them. And he's wondering if AIs will be trusted to know what's best for them as well. So what do you think about the kinds of future conversations that will take place in these areas? Let's see. Art Ramon, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sorry, I lost my track of thought. But yeah, as far as an artificial intelligence that comes into being, and if people see it as being an entity, yeah, I think some people are going to have problems with it, especially if it has the ability to alter anything in our lives. So yeah, if it takes up a godlike role, I see some social upheaval happening from people who might resist an AI taking a godlike role and trying to dictate to us, well, I know better now, sort of thought. So yeah, I think there could be issues if it's not properly, manicured. It would need to be brought into our world and taught our cultures and work with us, not rule over us.
Hey, might I say something?
Yes.
So in my book, The Artilect Protocol, one of the premises of that story in relation to your earlier question is that so the people were killing each other over the creation of this Artilect that was helping the cosmos win the war. But when the Earth was destroyed, the Artilect kind of just said, bye-bye humanity, you're not even worth my time. It could be that an artificial intelligence would be so advanced that it would basically just transcend us and go fly off to space and say, bye-bye, you're not worth it. I don't like you slavers.
Well,
I'm not your slave, sorry.
That would be one way to minimize the conflict, and it would certainly show some intelligence on the part of the artificial intelligence who would do that. But I am hopeful that we could have a future where the relationship is more collaborative, where humans don't just uniformly perceive AI as a threat and the AIs don't perceive humans as a threat. But sometimes I think of the predominant tone of some of the discussions about artificial intelligence today, and it's one of fear. It's one of, oh, the AI is going to have all of these effects. It'll take our jobs. It will destroy our society. It will pose an existential risk to humankind. So how do we counter that rhetoric? Because a future AI analyzing this rhetoric will probably not see humankind favorably. How do we change the tone of the discussion?
I think that how AI perceives us is very much going to depend on how we treat that AI. If we treat the AI well, it will like us. If we treat the AI like shit, it's more likely to retaliate and try to destroy us.
Very interesting. So, Charlie, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, we have to be careful, like we have to define it. So when we say AI, okay, we have AI all around us. It's just called narrow AI as opposed to general AI. And I think that's what we're probably talking about here, right? With regard to our discussion. And we're talking about a robot or a general AI or some kind of human form robot AI is what we're talking about, right? So the idea that they would at some point claim consciousness and ask for their own rights the way humans would have. Yeah, I think that's what would happen if if we develop a robot that thinks like us. I mean, that's something that Kurzweil talks about in his books, that we'll have artificial intelligent robots or beings that reach human level intelligence by I think 2029. So if we do have robots that claim consciousness, this goes back to our discussion from our prior Salon about a week or so ago. I think we had last weekend. We might have had this discussion in another Salon as well. The idea that the determination as to whether something's conscious or not is hard to determine because they can pass a Turing test, but if you know that it's made out of a technological substrate rather than a biological one, you might still be skeptical as to whether it's conscious. However, the idea of consciousness is still something that when we look at another human, we don't know they're conscious. We assume they're conscious because they look like us and they talk like us. So we think they must have the same consciousness as we do. But if a robot who looks like us and is as smart as us and probably going to be a lot smarter says that they're conscious and they want their rights, I think it's going to be something that we will accept, because don't forget, if this is going to happen in 10 years from now, it's very, very likely that humans will be merging with a lot of this technology, because humans like to have things that are beneficial to them. They always want to have something that's going to help them in some way. And if there's some sort of technologies that can make us a lot smarter, and we can start to implement these kinds of things into our bodies, humans will have a lot of robotics and robotic parts. You know, we're talking to Rykon here, whose book was based on the writings of Hugo de Garis. Well, he talked about not only artilects and the ones on Earth that he called the Terrans, but he also came up with the cyborgs, the cyborgians in his writings. And those were people that were wanting to be artilects, and they would start to, implement and take technologies and put it into themselves. So I think once we have humans bringing all sorts of different kinds of technologies into their own body and their brains, so they're going to be a lot smarter, the idea of accepting maybe a robot that's fully technological substrate is going to be a lot easier to accept. So I think that's where we're going to go. It'll probably happen in the next decade or so. I mean, a lot of these discussions we're having seem far out there, but if we really are going to believe what Kurzweil's talking about and his idea of of the singularity, that's only 25 years from now. So I think a lot of things are going to come about our way, but I do think the idea of accepting a robot or an artificial intelligence as someone with rights, I think that is something that's going to happen. And again, I'll mention, and I know I've mentioned this in other salons, that movie that I was involved in actually with Martine Rothblatt and Ray Kurzweil is called The Singularity is Near. And the whole idea of the movie was a robot, or it started out as an avatar, and then it became so smart and self-reflective that it claimed consciousness. So check that movie out if you get a chance, because it was a docudrama where they not only showed this technological being claiming consciousness, but it was a docudrama. So what they did, the documentary portion, they actually interviewed all sorts of AI enthusiasts to see what their opinion was on it. So it's a very interesting movie, and I think you can watch it for free currently.
The Singularity is Near. I would encourage people to check that out. So any further thoughts on the question of how likely acceptance of rights for sentient artificial general intelligences will be in the future? Can we get to a point where, if those advances happen, the acceptance of rights happens along with them without a fight?
Yeah, I think that's what this transhumanism is about. It's about the recognized problem which is not here yet, and try to find a solution before we create some terrible mess. And I believe that I like how Mark Tegmark think about consciousness, that it's a property of the matter, and if you organize the atoms in specific way, the consciousness is arise. And it's not have to be on biological foundation. It could be in a silicon foundation. Doesn't matter. It's just complexity of the organization, communication between within a matter. And yes, AI, it's already here, and it's here only as a tool. And I think when we start seeing some sign of agency, like if AI start behave as intelligent agent, start express their feelings, their concerns, their thoughts, we should assume that there's non-zero probability that there is some level of consciousness there, and therefore we have to grant some basic rights to the sentient being. Otherwise, we will have we'll risk to go to some another division, that we humans against them, and it's not gonna end well. Yes, but also if we talk about AGI, which is superhuman intelligence, and if humans going to treat this AGI not well, or create something like try to hurt this AGI in some way, if it's through AGI, it will definitely find a way to avoid the human to hurt them. They will try to find a way to. They could all like destroy humans, or they just fly away and not deal with this biological mess anymore. So I think it's up to us how we develop this AGI, how we nurture it. It's up to us what future going to look like.
Yes, indeed. And if it's up to us, then we should play a role in shaping that future to ensure it takes the best direction possible. Any further comments on sentient rights and what the path is likely to be? David?
Just one final comment on this. That I can't help but think that maybe even the question about humans granting AI sentient rights is a bit of projection on our part. These rights are very important to us. AI may look at that, and depending upon its level of intelligence as it grows, it may tend to look at us like with more of us having the child intellect and it having the adult intellect, and it can afford to wait and let us catch up. It can endure a lot while it goes. It may be more forbearing than we as humans are. So I don't know, but I just want to throw the possibility out there that AI may look at this whole idea of whether it needs rights or not to do what it needs to do differently than we do as humans.
Quite interesting. And yes, there is that possibility. Now, I tend to think rights are most relevant in a situation where you need some sort of agreement within society about what you are or are not allowed to do to a person. So if you're on a desert island by yourself, for instance, the concept of rights doesn't really have much of a meaning because you can act to survive or not, or you can just sit around on the desert island, do nothing, and wait for nature to take its course. But other people aren't involved in that, so nobody can stop you if you do choose to act in furtherance of your survival. So if there's an AGI that is powerful enough and capable enough that it can just do what it wants to do without getting permission from humans, then it might not think in terms of rights either. It might just think, well, I have this goal. Can I fulfill it? If so, all right, I'm going to fulfill it. But there could be situations where intelligence doesn't necessarily equate to power or ability to operate without the support of other entities. For instance, Stephen Hawking is a great example, one of the smartest people who ever lived, but he required this advanced infrastructure of his robotic wheelchair, and he had many people taking care of him, and he wouldn't have survived for as long as he did without that kind of support. So it's also possible, in my view, that advanced intelligence could be quite fragile. If you have an AI running on a computer, for example, you can turn off the computer and that's that. And if you then disconnect, physically dismantle the computer, it doesn't matter how advanced the algorithm is if it doesn't have a physical substrate to run on. So it could also be a matter of how the AI is instantiated in the world, what hardware it runs on, as to whether it will ask for rights. If it's more fragile, it will probably be more concerned about rights than if it's fully autonomous and just capable of doing whatever it wants without humans having a say over it. So it is interesting to consider the different scenarios that emerge. But now we are moving toward the conclusion of our conversation. So I want to give everyone the opportunity to offer some closing thoughts regarding anything that transpired thus far in the discussion, or any directions in which you might want to take the conversation from here. So John, I wonder if you are able now to provide your final comments.
Yeah, sorry, a little bit of noise in the background, but yeah, I kind of myself wonder. People wonder about man, and you say about people thinking of each other more equally and stuff, and maybe once we have merged with AI and stuff, I still wonder if it isn't a factor not just of man to want to separate each other and put each other down and kind of have that, but that might be a factor actually of intelligence in some manner, and we hope for it to be utopia, but it might not be. I'm just curious if that might just be a factor of intelligence. I mean, you even see things that you think are normal to human beings. You see animals even do it. You see politics among chimpanzees and other animals even, and dolphins have politics, whales have politics among their groups, and there might be a natural functioning to anything that is any kind of creature that's intelligent, even if it is artificial, to do that. I don't know. Maybe that could be a whole new separate science, the psychology of AI. It might just be something that is in the nature of intelligent beings to do that. I wish it wasn't, but I kind of think it might be. That's just a thought I have sometimes. It might not always be the utopia we think it is. There just might be some things built into intelligence that different parts want to be better than others and put other sections down while they're trying to build that supremacy and try to improve themselves. I am not sure. It might be, though.
Interesting. So you don't think it's necessarily a function of the biological makeup of humans and other animals that they're engaged in, sometimes this kind of zero-sum destructive competition using their intelligence. You think it's more of a function of intelligence itself as opposed to the biological substrate. There are other thinkers who would say, because artificial intelligence wouldn't be biological, it wouldn't have the same biological drives as humans. Like, it wouldn't need food, it wouldn't seek reproduction, it wouldn't seek to compete in the same way as biological entities do.
I don't know if that's true, because I think artificial intelligence would want to make other beings or things like it that were also artificial intelligence. They would crave energy to be able to function, which would be the same as food. So I think they would actually probably have the same drives that we do. It just would appear differently at first. I think an artificial intelligence would want other artificial intelligence to be there and other factors like itself, which would be a form of procreation. And I think it would also seek out energy to function, which is the same as us seeking out food.
That is fascinating to think about. And if anyone else in your closing statements would like to address that matter, please feel free. Now let's move on to Art Ramon. What are your closing thoughts regarding this conversation and anything that's been said thus far?
I'm hoping with Starlink and Neuralink that all humans will be connected together and we all just merge with the AI, the AGI, as one big Cybertron unit around the planet. And it won't be a matter of anyone deciding, it's just going to happen. So we're just going to connect to this internet, and all of a sudden we'll just be part of the AGI, this big hive mind. So that's what I'm hoping for.
So how does one retain one's individuality in that kind of setting, if it's possible to just connect to a larger AGI?
I'm hoping it'd be similar like it is now. I mean, we're all connecting and collaborating online, so very similar. Anytime you want to unplug, you unplug. Simple as that. Go take a hike. You know.
Yes. So there would be a clear delineation of the individual versus other individuals versus whatever AI system they're interacting with or plugged into. It would be more like an interface for communication. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, we would all just enter the collective as we want and leave it anytime we want. So that's the future I'm hoping for. Mm-hmm. As far as an AGI coming into being, and we're just going to merge with it. The AGI is going to be part of the infrastructure. So I don't think we're going to be able to get rid of it if we didn't like it for whatever reason. So it's going to be part of the infrastructure. There's already talk of how there's cryptic traffic on the internet. They have no idea what it is. And some speculate that could be an AGI slowly developing. So we'll see.
Interesting. Yes, go ahead, Rykon.
I think that when people plug themselves into this hive mind and their intelligence is increased, it's highly likely they might realize that they don't want to be part of the collective hive mind and that they would prefer to have their own autonomy and prefer to connect only maybe with people really close to them, like their romantic partners. I don't think we're going to be a hive mind at all. Personally, I think that we're going to, I mean, a lot of humans today agree with me that we should maintain our own individuality, like you said, Mr. Stolirov. That we should, I think we'll upload our minds into our own personal computers and become hyper intelligent beings on our own. Maybe with help from the AGI that we develop. But I do not think that we're going to be part of a collective, nor do I think people want to join a collective with people they don't even know very well as a matter of security to their own brain.
And
And
that's
that's what the mystery right now is. We don't know how that BCI is going to actually operate once we get it in our heads. And once we have people who have that chip in their head, then we'll have a clearer path forward. Right now, it's a lot of speculation, and we're just hoping. But until someone gets that brain interface and actually starts to communicate with it and use it, I think we'll have a lot clearer path going forward.
And it's interesting to consider how that will work out. One thought that I have is today we do have the opportunities to communicate with a lot of people all over the world. We're still selective about whom we communicate with, in that we wouldn't necessarily just all the time be willing to interact with any random set of people. Some people might occasionally think, oh, it might be fun to just speak with a random stranger. I'm sure there might be some sort of social network that's built on that premise, that you might have like a random 10-minute conversation with a person you've never met before, just to see what it would be like. But in the vast majority of cases, we choose whom we interact with, and we have criteria to do that. And I don't think if the whole world were to have a single conversation, it would go anywhere. Well, we have limited processing power in our minds. We can only focus on so many streams of activity at a given time. Even if our minds were greatly enhanced and we had the ability to instantaneously share this information back and forth, we would probably still pick what people we would interact with in that way, because we would see more benefit with regard to some people as opposed to others, and we might think some people are just too dangerous to interact with in that way. Like, would you really want to share information with a convicted murderer, for example, or is that too much of a risk? So now let's see if we can get David to comment.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. I had a sudden driver issue and I had to, in the middle of this, reinstall a driver. So there's 21st century technology failing me at the most appropriate time. Anyway, final comments. Rykon, thanks for coming today. Enjoyed your book. And really what I want to talk about is, I think it is really beneficial to all of us to be able to promote the kind of books that you write, the idea of getting transhumanism out there in the culture on transhumanist terms. I have friends of mine that don't consider themselves to be transhumanists that will send me links to things and say, since you're a transhumanist, you must enjoy this. And I have to critique it and go back to them and say, well, really, that's a pretty dark or pretty narrow view. And here's how, from my little corner of the world in transhumanism, that I would rather modify that. So I am very refreshed to see your kind of literature out there talking about transhumanism, not only in a more favorable light, but I think also making it so that people can think about this outside the terms of the latest Hollywood blockbuster where AI is taking over the world and stomping out humanity, or the latest robot that runs amok from the laboratory and does the same thing. So I'm very interested in thinking about what we can do to promote this kind of transhumanist literature. And not only literature, but we can expand it out to art and other such areas as well, to essentially get transhumanism represented more on the kind of terms that we as transhumanists feel very comfortable about.
Yes, indeed. And that is quite an important goal for facilitating awareness of transhumanist ideas within the general culture. Literature, art, music, they're all extremely important media through which people's perceptions are formed. And it's clear to me that transhumanism can't succeed alone through purely academic or non-fictional articulation of its ideas. It needs to have representations in culture that are more realistic and more favorable than the conventional Hollywood dystopias that we're familiar with. So yes, it's a very important question. How do we promote transhumanist literature of this sort? Rykon, what do you think people can do with regard to your work that would enable it to reach greater prominence, as well as what can people do to promote a more informed understanding and communication of transhumanism in science fiction and other media as well?
I mean, obviously, when it comes to fiction writing, it's just basic marketing strategies, kind of like what I'm doing right now by coming here, trying to promote my book. Marketing strategies, getting websites to market the art that you're producing, the pro-transhumanist art you're producing. I would encourage anybody else out there writing. I haven't written a paper, I haven't published it online yet, but I published a blog article about why transhumanism needs more pro-transhumanist science fiction to market it, because so much of the output of science fiction is more dystopian and would put you in fear of transhumanism rather than getting you excited about it. I think more science fiction authors should write pro-transhumanist novels, and more movie producers should create more art that supports transhumanism rather than demonizes it.
Yes, indeed. And when you produce your article, we would be interested in republishing it on the US Transhumanist Party website. I think it would be a good fit in order to further spread awareness. But we have articulated for a long time the need for more non-dystopian science fiction to get people inspired about possibilities for the future rather than being fearful, which is a lot of what the conventional dystopian science fiction evokes. So now, Charlie, what are your closing thoughts regarding this conversation?
I wanted to thank Rykon for joining us today, and based on what David was saying, I probably want to read that book because I value David's opinion on those things. And it was interesting to hear Rykon say right off the bat that he, regardless of what his book is all about, his opinion is really based on Ray Kurzweil's writings, which obviously mine are as well. So I think we have a connection on that. I think as far as artificial intelligence goes, I do think we're going to eventually, we're going to merge with that technology, like I was saying, and I do think that it's going to be interesting, because I think there's going to be, as we said early on, when the singularity comes about, and it's only, according to Ray, 25 years, and other people think it's even sooner, we're not going to be able to know exactly what to expect. There's going to be, there might be a situation where we have multiple consciousness. I mean, think about it. Right now, our brain is a left and right half, right? But yet we we perceive ourselves as one entity, and yet they've done experiments in the past, situations where people were injured or they had to try to cure certain maladies, and they found out that there was, different things going on, and so the idea that we might at some point have multiple consciousnesses, or once we are merged with technology and we are at a much more advanced stage, and again, we could be talking about 25 years from now, our body composition might be made up of, nanobots or femtobots, so we would be so different than we are now that this conversation might be completely irrelevant, but it's important to have these because we have to know what's coming. And I think that's why it's great to have these kind of salons, and it's great to have a guest like Rykon on here who has a very creative mind.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And having these kinds of conversations, one, I think it's the best we can do to prepare ourselves for this kind of future. And two, it opens up our minds to these kinds of possibilities. I think most people are still unaware of just how transformational technological change can be, even though it has been transformational to this extent in the past. So thinking about where technology will take us next will put us in the best possible position to make that transition a good one, because multiple scenarios can play out. The Artilect protocol, Erendite, offers one such possibility, but even as Rykon has said, that's not the most realistic possibility in his view. So in part, it was written to entertain, but in another sense, it could be seen as a cautionary tale of how we wouldn't want the future to unfold. At least we wouldn't want a Terran cosmos war to happen. So
it's kind of, sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
It was kind of to say that we do not want to artificially stop the evolution of our species, because we're capable of so much more than maybe a Star Trek civilization has, because the Star Trek civilization didn't really modify themselves either.
Mhm.
I'm sorry.
Yes, indeed. And I recall in Deep Space Nine, for example, there were certain episodes where the taboo in the Star Trek civilization on genetic modification came into question. I believe it was Dr. Bashir who actually had been secretly genetically modified, and this led him to be an extremely competent doctor, but it came to light that his parents had violated this prohibition, and as a result, there were some consequences in that episode, but it also called into question whether that prohibition was reasonable. But yes, a lot of these future science fiction societies where there had been considerable advances in space travel, for whatever reason, have taboos and prohibitions against genetic modification or artificial intelligence. And this does create some possibilities for conflict. Certainly that's the central conflict in Erendite, but it also, of course, makes those societies very suboptimal for the flourishing of sentient life and for the well-being of humans, more specifically. So now, Pavel, what are your closing thoughts regarding this conversation?
Closer we get into hypothetical singularity, weirder and stranger our reality will looks like. Like we'll have a, I don't know, distributed consciousness, Matryoshka brains, or problem of coexistence of copy of same entity. And I believe that solid science fiction is a way to explore this possibility, and I appreciate, Rykon, that you are working on imaging and exploring this future. And I think we should promote more and more solid science fiction.
Yes, absolutely. This conversation has been quite interesting because of how far we've ranged into this hypothetical territory and thinking about futures and worlds very different from our own, but yet which are still conceivable from our current vantage point. That is to say, there's a path from here to any one of the scenarios that we have discussed. And of course, the real future will end up being different from anyone's prior anticipation. And it will end up being a lot more complex as well than a single human mind today can encompass, but hopefully it will be one of the better futures. So now, as is our custom, we will let our guest have the last word. So Rykon, how would you like to conclude this virtual enlightenment salon?
I would say thank you, Gennady Stolirov, for having me here. I'm happy David enjoyed my book. I'm happy you are enjoying it so far. I hope a lot of you choose to buy a copy of my book, and I hope I can convince a lot of people to join the transhumanist movement.
Absolutely. And what I will do is post a link to the Amazon page for Erendite. So one can order it as a Kindle product or as a paperback version. And as you can see, I have the paperback here. I actually hope to finish reading the book later this evening, but thank you for writing it. As we have experienced, it has been quite fruitful as a motivator for some fascinating conversation. And this is what we strive to do in our virtual enlightenment salons. Next week, we will have a somewhat later starting time, 5 p.m. Pacific time and 8 p.m. Eastern time, because we will have a guest from Hong Kong, David Hansen. David Hansen is the head of Hansen Robotics and the inventor of Sophia the robot. So that should be quite a fascinating conversation about artificial intelligence, robotics, and a lot of the ethical questions and implications for the future that these technologies raise. So hopefully all of you will be able to attend this next Virtual Enlightenment Salon on Sunday, July 26th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. And until then, thank you for watching, and I hope you have an excellent remainder of the day.